NASCAR legend Richard "The King" Petty has broken his silence, and he's not pulling any punches. The 7-time Cup Series champion has slammed NASCAR on multiple fronts, calling out everything from inconsistent caution flags to the sport's desperate need for more horsepower. When the King speaks, the racing world listens, and what he's saying now has shocked fans and officials alike. Some races go down in history for their edge-of-your-seat action and photo finishes. Others, they're remembered for the controversies that overshadow everything else, just like the 2021 Abu Dhabi F1 Grand Prix that left fans fuming. The 2025 Ambetter Health 400 will be remembered for all the wrong reasons, particularly NASCAR's wildly inconsistent caution flags. NASCAR fans are absolutely frustrated searching for answers in the chaos of recent officiating calls. And who better to set things straight than Richard "The King" Petty himself, with decades of experience and an unmatched understanding of stock car racing. Petty's insights cut through the noise as fans try to make sense of these unpredictable caution flags. In a recent Q&A session, Petty didn't hold back when a fan asked about NASCAR's constant instability with caution calls on the final lap. The King voiced his concerns in no uncertain terms. A bunch of discussions about this because one race, they throw the flag, the next race, they don't throw the caution. This flip-flopping approach has left both fans and drivers completely baffled, especially after 3 recent incidents that show just how inconsistent NASCAR officials have become. At the 2025 Ambetter Health 400, officials threw a caution after a wreck on the final lap. Just one day earlier at the Bennett 250 on the same track, a nearly identical wreck happened on the final lap, but NASCAR let drivers race to the finish. And if that wasn't confusing enough, during the 2025 Daytona 500, NASCAR allowed leading drivers to race back to the start-finish line before throwing the caution flag. 3 similar situations, 3 completely different calls. Is it any wonder fans are scratching their heads? Petty knows these are tough calls, but offered his straightforward perspective. He said, "If you're in the middle of the crowd and have a wreck, I can see him throwing a caution. But if it's at the back end of the race that's running, I can't see him throwing a caution." Dale Inman, Petty's legendary crew chief, also weighed in on the controversy, admitting, "I'd hate to be the one to have to call that decision." Petty agreed completely, saying, "I'm glad I don't have to make that decision." But while Petty and Inman understand the challenges, they're still pushing for NASCAR to get its act together. Inman didn't mince words when he said, they do need to come up with a plan. The implication is crystal clear. NASCAR needs consistent guidelines that will eliminate confusion and restore integrity to the sport. Inman added, "I'm sure they're working on it." NASCAR fans have responded passionately to Petty's straight talk, offering their own solutions to the caution conundrum. One fan suggested we might as well race back as long as the wreck is at least a certain distance past the start-finish line. Another fan highlighted how track differences complicate the issue. At Daytona, the laps are long enough for NASCAR to let them race, but at a place like Atlanta, laps go by way too quickly. This makes perfect sense when you consider that Daytona International Speedway's 2.5-mile layout gives officials more time to assess situations compared to Atlanta Motor Speedway's shorter 1.54-mile configuration, where decisions must be made in seconds. A third fan called for more accountability. "I think it should be in the sole hands of the race director whether he deems it safe to race to the finish line before waving the yellow flag." This fan proposed solution puts responsibility squarely on one person's shoulders, rather than a committee that might be slowing down the decision-making process. So what's the solution? NASCAR officials are keeping quiet, but one thing's for sure, Richard Petty has put them on notice. At its core, NASCAR has always been about pushing limits, testing both machines and men to their absolute breaking points. Richard Petty built his legendary status on high-speed, high-drama racing that kept fans on the edge of their seats. He knows exactly what makes the sport exciting, and he's not afraid to tell NASCAR what they're doing. Wrong. While fans complain about today's racing lacking excitement, the King thinks the answer couldn't be simpler: more horsepower and more speed. Petty has seen it all in NASCAR. He remembers when the sport's biggest names weren't just drivers, but gladiators pushing their cars to the absolute edge of control. He recalls races at Daytona and Talladega, where drafting was just a tool, not a necessity, and the fastest car actually dictated the pace instead of being stuck in the pack. Petty recalled, "We'd go out there, and if you had a strong car, you could break away. You didn't have to worry about everybody stacking up behind you, waiting for someone to slip." In his most recent statements, Petty didn't hold anything back. He said, "The more we can do to make it exciting is give it more horsepower so they'll go faster. The faster they go, the harder the driver must remain on his toes. And when you've got cars racing 200 miles per hour as opposed to 185, all the drivers aren't qualified to run that speed that close to one another. So that's the first thing to actually differentiate the cars, because that's the way it used to be."
A bunch of discussions about this, because one race they throw the flag, the next race they don't throw the caution. I can see them again. If you're in the middle of the crowd and have a wreck, I can see them throwing a caution. But if it's at the back end of the race that's running, I can't see them throwing a caution. So I'm glad I don't have to make that decision.
The King just words echo what many veteran fans have been saying for years. The current package, which restricts horsepower and forces closer racing, has created more parity, but has killed the excitement that made NASCAR great. It's not just about the horsepower. Either Dale Inman, the legendary crew chief closely associated with Petty, took aim at another modern NASCAR problem fuel mileage tactics that have sucked the life out of racing. Inman said the gas mileage thing, saving gas that just changes the speed we're racing now, and it'll change Atlanta some coming up Sunday too. I wish there was some way they could give them enough gas where they could run to the stages. And it didn't affect the saving fuel stuff. This hits on a major fan complaint. Instead of drivers pushing their machines to the limit for the entire race, they're now forced to conserve fuel, creating long stretches where they're not racing at full throttle. How is that exciting for anyone? The horsepower and fuel debate isn't new, but it's reaching a boiling point. Longtime NASCAR fans reminisce about the days when cars thundered down the backstretch at uncontrolled speeds, challenging not just the equipment, but the raw skill of the drivers. Today's emphasis on cost saving and safety has changed the sport dramatically. But as excitement wanes, Petty's call to return to NASCAR's roots is growing louder. Safety will always matter, but where's the balance? NASCAR needs to find the sweet spot between competition and thrill, and if Richard Petty and Dale Inman are any indication, many believe it's time to return to the sport's high-octane roots. Richard Petty isn't the only NASCAR star calling for change. Three-time Daytona 500 winner Denny Hamlin has stepped up to echo. The King's sentiments and his reasoning might surprise you. Following Ryan Preece's terrifying wreck, Hamlin expressed his anger toward NASCAR's modern superspeedway package. On his Actions Detrimental podcast, Hamlin didn't pull any punches.
I don't know. Let's be a little careful with just these knee-jerk reactions. The knee-jerk reactions is why we've gotten to run 175 miles an hour on these tracks. And it's why we're crashing each other so hard. Like, I'd rather let us run 200 with a little more space, and it would be less dangerous. It would. I'm telling you, it would be.